Good morning. I'd like to call the meeting to order of the Ordinance Committee meeting. We will start with a roll call.
Madam Chair Snedden.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse. Here. Mayor Murillo.
Here.
And I'm not seeing any public comment on items that are not on the agenda. Is that correct? Okay, thank you. And will we be hearing another staff presentation, or you're available to us? Just comments. Okay, thank you. So,
Madam Chair, yes. This is new, the Single Family Design Board minutes. Did you include that, if I may ask questions, did you include that in the presentation last time, or you referred to it?
Right, got it. Madam Chair and Mayor Murillo, that was going to be part of my comments, staff comments. I can just make them now. We have provided to your Ordinance Committee on March 2nd, we provided to you some supplemental information, and hard copies of that information are available in the back of the room on the bench near where you fill out the slips to speak. Also, just provided today are copies of the Single Family Design Board minutes from February 20th, and there are hard copies of that document as well at the back of the room.
thank you. Did you have any more questions on that at the moment?
Well, did you summarize? Can you summarize them, or I mean, it seems like new-ish information for the public and the committee.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, do you want a summary of the memo or the minutes?
The minutes, please.
Oh, okay. So the minutes just reflect the comments that were heard at the Single Family Design Board hearing. And they generally reflect general comments we got about the ordinance itself and the statewide or the state law regarding accessory dwelling units. A couple of comments reflect back to the design criteria that we are looking at as part of the ordinance. But like I said, it's generally some comments made about design review of accessory dwelling units.
Thank you.
Before we begin discussing or continuing our item on draft ordinance amendments related to the regulation of accessory dwelling units, we will be having our last acceptance of speaker slips at 11:45. So if you are hoping to speak, please bring forward your speaker slip. We do intend to hear public comment that was held over from our last meeting and whatever notices were brought in today. And we are hoping to get to deliberations today, so I'm hoping to keep the public comment moving and to take your input into consideration. So with that, were there any other questions for staff before we listen to more public comment? No. Okay, then I'd like to invite Suzanne Elledge up, followed by Valerie Froscher. Are you present? Oh, these were from last meeting, so we'll continue. Is Steve Young present? And Steve Young is Roberta Young, also present. Okay, so you're pooling your time. You'll have 4 minutes.
Can we just get this going first? Okay, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Most of the discussion that I've heard so far has been, should we have a covenant or not? But the point I want to bring up is that the specific covenant, which I haven't heard discussed much, is in itself very egregious. It, for example, ignores many situations where the homeowner may need to withdraw the ADU status. For example, somebody might want to go abroad for a couple of years, can't afford to do it without renting their house. And to have the ADU status withdrawn so that they can not, because they're not a homeowner anymore, is a real problem, because according to the way the covenant is written, it allows staff the discretion to pull out a kitchen, pull out a bathroom, or even demolish the whole ADU. That's at discretion. Now, I trust they wouldn't do more than they really had to, but you're basically giving them permission to pull down the whole ADU. If it's part of your house, it could actually be destroying the house. So that's a real issue. I know there are some hardship clauses proposed for when people want to take away the ADU status, for example, if they have to go into a nursing home or something. But those hardship clauses are also discretionary, and they cover only some predetermined situations. They wouldn't cover, for example, the situation I just described of wanting to go abroad for a couple of years. And perhaps even more seriously, I should perhaps have put this as number one, your mortgage may be called in. I hadn't realized that, but there was one example presented last week, and I think we're going to hear more, where mortgage companies are saying, if you sign that covenant, we're going to call your mortgage in. That's real serious. And there's also potential, if you want to sell, if and when you want to sell your property, that the new owner won't be able to get a mortgage if it's an ADU attached property. So that could be a problem for them. So these are the arguments that I've heard. Can you move it down a little bit, Lonnie? Pro-covenant. First of all, it's said to protect against bad tenants. Well, my response, the city already lets me rent my home, pre-ADU home, so it presumably gives me the benefit of the doubt with regarding to my judgment as to how to pick tenants. So that won't change if I get an ADU on property. Secondly, it's said to protect against speculative purchases for people who want to just create duplexes. I understand that. However, I'd like to say that the covenant,
It's counting down. You have 1 minute left.
I don't have 4 minutes in total?
It was 4 minutes in total. You have 1 minute left.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. My response regarding speculative purchases is that the need, instead of a covenant, should be an ordinance saying that the primary DU and the ADU can't be rented to different people, and also maybe require people who are applying to a permit to have lived in the property for a certain period, maybe 3 years. Example, how would it work? A homeowner with an ADU who wants to travel can rent the property to a responsible tenant. The tenant could use the ADU but not rent it out. For example, for an adult child who might be a first responder, which was a real case in the earlier meeting. So what I think we should do, we should require people applying for a permit to have lived there for a certain period of time. 3 years, I don't know what time. Secondly, create an ordinance prohibiting rental of the primary ADU and a primary DU and the ADU to different parties.
You're at time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And thirdly, allow the homeowner to take away the ADU status without destroying.
We do have a question from Councilmember Rouse.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think you have some interesting ideas, and I wonder, in the interest of getting the rest of the public comment, if you wouldn't mind submitting those to us in an email so we could review them.
Certainly.
Thank
I'd love
you.
to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have, is Valerie Fosher here now, present? And are you pooling time with anyone? No. Okay. Thank you.
Hello, Chair Sneddon and members of the committee. Thank you for hearing the public comment on this important topic. Many people are working very hard to provide Santa Barbara with a good ordinance that works with the state mandates, protects the community, and also serves the public who desire ADUs. My name is Valerie Froscher, and I speak as an architect, a 40-year resident of Santa Barbara, a longtime review board member, and member of the AIA. I was also part of the subcommittee that worked together with staff here at the city regarding the ADUs. Our interest in ADUs is certainly not in creating work for architects. I want to make that really clear. The people that have been putting a lot of time into this are not looking at this as an income-generating feature, but we're interested in the value of encouraging low-density infill housing proposed by regular people in our community, and to try to help simplify the process through our professional experience. After the 6-hour PC hearing of January 25th, I would focus on some specific areas that are still too complicated in the staff report of February 27th. Pages 5, 6, and 7 address the max floor area ratio, and combined accessory structure calculations, as well as the open yard requirements. Please direct staff to simplify these to one gradated chart of allowable ADU size per lot size, similar to the AIA drafted ordinance that you have in your possession. And please consider making the open yard requirement 10% of the lot with 10 by 10 minimum dimensions, including driveway, as proposed in the AIA draft ordinance. There are unintended consequences for the complexity of this ordinance, and we are very fearful that if it moves forward as it's written now, that it will preclude most ADU applications. Thank you.
Thank you. Is Todd Amspoker here? Thank you. And he will be followed by Natalie Cope-Phillips. Present? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor Murillo, members of the council. My name is Todd Amspoker. I'm speaking today on behalf of myself. Also, I've been working with members of the AIA regarding the ADU ordinance. I've got just a couple of quick comments on the ADU covenant issue. I did want to let you know that I've been following state legislation, which is amending the current code section regarding ADUs, and I understand on very good authority from a representative of the HCD in Sacramento that the new state legislation is going to forbid ADU covenants. And I understand, according to the person I talked to, the new language is going to show up during the week of March 12th in Senate Bill 831. So for that reason, I think that the city needs to be very careful about requiring a covenant when it appears the state is going to outlaw it. I also wanted to mention on the high fire issue and outlawing ADUs in the high fire areas. I was at the Plan Commission meeting. Plan Commission wanted to have some provision for being able to have ADUs in the high fire area. It's not clear to me why staff is recommending against what the Planning Commission said. The other thing is that the state law says there's supposed to be criteria for establishing whether an ADU is causing an impact on public safety. There's nothing in the city's proposed statute that contains any criteria about how we're going to make decisions about whether ADUs are going to be allowed in the high fire area. Thank you.
Thank you. And Natalie Cope-Phillips, you are pooling time with Sean Evans. Present? Thank you. Just started. Okay, is this your slide?
Yes.
Okay. Time now.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Ordinance Committee members. My name is Natalie Cope-Phillips. I'm a local architect and homeowner who's currently processing my own ADU. And because I've been intimately involved in designing an ADU, especially a detached unit, I know how difficult it is to make it work on a typical property based on the current open yard requirements. I have major concerns with the open yard requirements planning staff has proposed to you today. Allowing a very small encroachment of only 250 square feet max into the existing conforming or non-conforming open yard will only benefit ADU garage conversions or additions, but it will do nothing for detached ADUs because 250 square feet is not large enough for even a small studio. And detached ADUs could be even less intrusive than a second-story unit over a garage that may look into a neighboring property. Instead, I ask that you consider using the previous ordinance's multifamily open yard requirements, which were 10% of the lot size with a 10-foot by 10-foot minimum dimension. Take a look at the diagram from left to right. The first site plan demonstrates adding the maximum allowable ADU on a typical 5,000 square foot lot. However, please note, you also have to comply with all the setbacks, the max FAR, the max accessory unit square footage, and the max ADU size, many layers. The middle site plan, you will see if you apply the current NZO open yard requirement, which is 1,250 square feet with a 20 by 20 foot dimension, you get absolutely nothing for an ADU. However, on the final plan, if you apply the previous ordinance requirement that I'm requesting, you get a 600 square foot ADU. And there's still additional open yard space in the front yard not accounted for in this diagram. In conclusion, I request that the planning staff be directed to use a standard open yard requirement for all lots, 10% of the lot size with a 10-foot long by 10-foot wide minimum dimension, and provide that 250 square foot encroachment option for only lots with existing non-conforming open yards. Thank you, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. Madam Mayor?
I have a question for staff. Thanks. It's just, this is all getting so thick. Can I stop and ask for you to respond to what Ms. Copeland said? Copeland said?
Cope Phillips. Cope Phillips.
Thank you. Ms. Brooke, what people are worried that they're not going to be able to build an ADU if the open yard requirements are too strict?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mayor Murillo. Ms. Dicey is going to bring up some slides that we have showing different open yard examples. 49. Let's start with 49. Actually, start with. So just a brief overview again of. Sorry. 47. No. Okay. I have a different presentation. Okay. We understand there's concerns raised by applicants as to whether or not accessory dwelling units could be accommodated with the open yard requirements. And so since the Planning Commission direction and hearing and this Ordinance Committee hearing, we have added to the ordinance a provision that would allow ADUs to encroach up to 20% or 250 square feet, or 20% or 150 square feet, whichever is greater, whether you have conforming or non-conforming open yard. And we believe that's a good compromise because, again, it's a matter of meeting the intent of the open yard. And there have been suggestions to instead require the open yard requirements for multifamily lots. But we're not dealing with multifamily development. We're dealing with single unit residences with accessory dwelling unit. And so staff continues to recommend that we have open yard requirements that reflect more or less that single family neighborhood character. And we don't believe it would preclude the construction of ADUs. As we've seen already with the state law in effect, over 70% of the ADUs that we've seen proposed are conversion of existing structures, which means there is no additional open yard requirement in order to convert those structures to ADUs. So we've seen those go through without open yard even applying. And we do have some examples of other ADUs where there has been a need for a minor encroachment into the open yard to make the dwelling unit more livable. And we can show those. I think we have those here, but if you want to see those examples of diagrams.
Yes, please.
In the meantime, I believe Councilmember Rouse has a question.
Thank you. In your examples, and you were showing a lot, I was thinking about the same size lot but a corner lot. Mm-hmm. And is your proposal go into the existing setbacks, or how would that work on a corner lot of that size?
All setbacks are maintained, so we're not asking to build any kind of ADU or anything like that in the setbacks.
Okay.
So open yard can be in some setbacks, but not in front yard setbacks. So in a corner lot, you're reduced even more so on two sides.
Right. All right. Thank you.
And then staff, were we still answering a question with figures?
Are we having technical
Madam
difficulties?
Chair, we're having
I
some
see.
we have the incorrect presentation on the desktop, so we're
Okay.
working on getting the slides up, and then we can discuss those.
Let's continue with public comment, and then when it comes to council, we can go through the slides. Thank you. Next, we have Ellen Bildstein, present. Bildston, no. Fred Sweeney, present. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the council. Fred Sweeney, I'm the chair of the Single Family Design Board. We're kind of the third string review group. And so I'm here today to share with you action our board took last night at our last night meeting to speak on their behalf, and contrary a little bit to staff's portrayal of what happened in our meeting. We did have some very specific items that we wanted to talk about, one of which I'm handing out to you. I'm not going to read it. It's too lengthy. Can't do it in the 2 minutes. So let me just read so I can stay in the next 40 seconds, I guess. We believe that the proposed design criteria acceptable would request the shiny material not be allowed under any circumstances, even if it is to match existing material. We are concerned that the potential height of standalone ADUs may affect public view and/or noise conditions that are specific to the project site topography. We don't believe the state law prohibits cities from making that determination. The city should have the authority under certain circumstances to determine the best location for standalone ADU with respect to public reviews and neighborhood noise conflicts. We are very concerned about the use of porches, balconies, and decks as part of the ADU. Proposed ordinance does not address the potential for an applicant to propose up to 1,200 square feet. That's 3 two-car garages. Such decks may be proposed on the roof of an ADU that is built on top of a garage. This could have an adverse effect to the neighborhood compatibility, which we have to look at, particularly in neighborhoods near the ocean and on hillsides. We are also concerned that having no requirements to screen off street parking, particularly when parking is being required to offset converted garages, we have all the adverse impacts on the streetscape of many neighborhoods. We now see the ramifications of such applications as it's being carried out along Las Positas opposite the Earl Warren Showgrounds. We believe that the proposed yes-no design criteria being proposed may not be sufficient to ensure adequate ministerial review of ADUs.
We're at time.
We recommend that the city will need to hire a qualified design architect to provide this review. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Kevin Dumaine present, followed by Alex Peugeot.
Okay. My name is Kevin Dumaine, and I'm an architect and Mesa resident. Our community, like most of the state, needs a mix of additional housing, but the current policies and local regulations often conflict with this need. Of all the recent housing mandates to come down from the state, the ADU legislation is our best option. This is a neighborhood-friendly way to disperse the impacts in a gradual manner. Senator Wachowski has recognized the value of peeling back the layers of regulation and giving individual homeowners the opportunity to creatively solve their own housing needs. This path can lead to healthy, vital neighborhoods. In Santa Barbara, though, we have a tendency to try to solve problems with more rules. Before you deliberate on the proposed ordinance, I urge you to pay attention to the PC meeting. Better yet, watch their deliberations carefully. Outside of the context of specific technical questions was a discussion that just began to touch on the real needs of our community and a reassessment of which priorities really matter. Commissioner Jordan's comments about the open yard requirements were spot on. Beautiful, delightful outdoor living spaces can be created with less space than is currently required or proposed. The ordinance that staff has presented tends to go the opposite direction. More rules, most of which appear sound on their own, but collectively they become overly restrictive. Why, for example, should a homeowner with an ADU have more restrictions on a second floor addition than his or her neighbor without an ADU? What's with this implicit bias against renters behind so many of these policies? Keep in mind, that the sum of a series of precise regulations is not better ADUs, but far, far fewer ADUs. You certainly have a difficult task in front of you. It's easy to support, voice support for housing, but to sincerely support housing in our community, you'll have to make some very difficult decisions and to commit to changes where changes are appropriate. By encouraging and supporting ADUs, you can make a positive difference and give ordinary homeowners the tools and means to help alleviate this housing crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Peugeot, followed by Jeremy Gorin. Garant, present? Okay, thank you. Gorin. Alex Peugeot first. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm Alex Peugeot, and I have a handout listing 5 things that you may want to you will probably talk about at the end of the hearing. As you know, where ordinances get to this board, things are usually vetted out. But that's not the way this process has worked out. This, you probably understand, it is the most important ordinance in a generation, and it's coming to you without public hearings, without minimum public hearings, I won't say no, absolutely no workshops. The AIA organized 4 workshops, as you know, 2 in Spanish, 2 in English, and we gathered a lot of input. And these things are very complicated to speak in 2 minutes, and I will not try to do that. But I just mentioned in owner occupancy, that is not just a yes or no answer, there are nuances to it. And in unit size, why do you need 3 layers, 3 different ways to limit the size of a unit, as indicated in that document? And also pay attention to height, which is nowhere in your report except on the attachment 3, item number 6, where it talks about how the height of the ADU will be limited. I will just read a letter from Diana Miller from the Alta Mesa neighborhood. My husband and I live in our daughter's home. They live abroad but hope to return after they get their 3 kids through college. They charge us a very reasonable amount for rent so that we can afford this, but are having a hard time covering the mortgage. The house is perfectly suited for an ADU, but with the owner-occupant restrictions, it is not possible. I'm telling you this because we would be unable to attend the city meetings, and I thought there might be an opportunity for someone to bring to light how the city should consider being open to extenuating circumstances like ours. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you please state your first and last name?
My handwriting's terrible, I know. Jarrett Gorin from Vanguard Planning, a huge supporter of accessory dwelling units, and I agree with all of the previous speakers. I'm here because I'm just concerned about the process here. We elect your council, and then your council appoints a planning commission, which is really the designated planning body for the city, and it's their job to hash out major issues on ordinances like this before they get to your committee and then ultimately to the city council. The PC had 2 hearings on this ordinance, and they lasted over 10 hours, and they were very heavily attended by the public. Now, I get paid to go to hearings like those. A lot of people don't. They took time out from their jobs and their lives to come down and participate in the process. And the PC considered the staff recommendations and all the public comments, and they provided detailed feedback to our planning staff. And there's certain concepts that staff proposed which were overwhelmingly rejected by both the public and the planning commission. For example, the categorical exclusion of high fire hazard areas for ADUs. Even the fire department isn't proposing that. So it's unclear to me why these very same concepts are still being pushed forward in the version of the ordinance that we have today. In over 20 years as a planner in both the government and the private sector, I've never seen anything quite like this. I'm concerned about the implications that it has for this public review process specifically and the public review process in general. Why should people take hours out of their lives to come down and participate and provide input for the Planning Commission when staff can just disregard that if they don't agree with it? I hope that you'll take our input very seriously in the Planning Commission's direction, and I have confidence that you will. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick Kuntz, present, followed by Cassandra Ensberg. Is Cassandra here? Thank you. Just a moment, Mr. Kuntz. I think your microphone is not on. We'll take care of it and give you. Yeah. Thank you.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Mayor Murillo, and Councilman Rouse. I want to start by taking a moment to thank staff for their efforts on this draft ordinance. I may not always agree with them, but I do appreciate their position and efforts. Some here today may remember that I served the city on both the Access Advisory Committee and the Fire Safety Code Board of Appeals. Of course, my opinions I'm sharing today are only that of a member of the public and that of a frustrated ADU applicant who's 180 days into what should be a 120-day process. The City Council, the Planning Commission, the fire officials, and the overwhelming majority of the public who have provided comments on high fire areas are all opposed to the blanket exclusion, as am I. I recognize that while health and safety concerns may be higher in some areas, they are substantially mitigated or non-existent in others. I ask that this committee please support the Planning Commission's direction to remove the blanket exclusion in high fire areas. Regarding the covenant, while I appreciate some of the intent behind it, I have far too many reservations to delineate in my afforded time. This is an important issue that is deserving of extensive community discussion. Members of the AIA have some great ideas on the subject, and I urge this committee to foster a more inclusive dialogue before recommending the covenant restrictions as part of this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. Cassandra Ensberg, and followed by Andreas Blomst, present. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair Snedden, Mayor Murillo, and Councilman Rouse. My name is Cassandra Ensberg, and I'm a Santa Barbara architect. I have been working with a team of local architects and others who support the ADUs, and I support all the comments of the other people who have spoken before me. We need affordable housing to realize as many safe and neighborhood-compatible ADUs as possible. I support an easy-to-use, understandable ADU standalone ordinance that abides by the state law. I have the following requests. 1, may we please see a copy of the actual proposed draft ordinance to read it for ourselves in lieu of a staff report about it. 2, much public input was expressed and work done by the Planning Commission on 25th January. May we please abide by their recommendations, most of which received a supermajority vote. May we please see the comments that staff received from HDC about the proposed draft ordinance. And may we please ask staff to replace the phrase, once application is deemed complete, with once application is taken in. I don't know what deemed complete means. It's very confusing. We are making this much harder than it needs to be. I urge you to look at the AIA-SB standalone ordinance draft as an example and consider directing staff to create a similar one through a committee process with help from design professionals in our community. Together we have the talent, and with open minds we can do this. Thank you.
Thank you. May I ask a question of staff for just a moment? To see the actual draft and the comments from HDC, are those are public record, yes?
Madam Chair, correct. And the draft ordinance is attached to your February 27th Ordinance Committee agenda report. That's the full text of the proposed draft ordinance. And in the Planning Commission staff report, their hearing that was eventually held on January 25th, We had a summary in that staff report of the comments that we received from HCD and how we responded to their comments.
And those are both available to the public?
Correct.
Yes, thank you. Hello.
Hi, my name is Andreas Blumst. I just want to talk a little bit more about the open space requirement. The only example that you'll see in the proposal from city staff is right here, and one is an ADU built on top of a garage. The other is converting a garage. They don't address a new construction ADU, which in most cases on the smaller lots in Santa Barbara would make more sense to have a single-story unit as opposed to losing a parking space or building a second story close to the property line where you have privacy issues. I also just wanted to show you, this is City of Santa Barbara's R2 zone, Chapter 2818. This is from the existing code, which on a R2 lot between 5,000 and 6,000 square feet requires an open yard of at least 600 square feet or two areas, each which must be at least 300 square feet. Minimum dimensions of each area of open yard shall be at least 10 feet long and 10 feet wide. That's what we currently have for R2 lots between 5,000 and 6,000 square feet. What's being proposed is that we go to 1,250 square feet for that same R2 lot at 5,000 square feet. And I'm just curious why, if we didn't get any ADUs built with the last ordinance, would we now make it even more restrictive? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have Brent Weinsbrenner present, followed by Lori Rafferty?
My name is Brent Weinbrenner. I'm a photographer and was very surprised when I found out that I had two front yards by living in a corner lot. So I'm completely unqualified to speak to any of the details of this. But what I can tell you is we live on the west side. In 5 years, I've never seen anybody pull into or out of their garage. The parking situation there is lost. We're surrounded by illegal units, and I would defy anybody to come into the neighborhood and identify an owner-occupied versus a rental property. In short, the character of my neighborhood will not change one whit by the addition of an ADU. In fact, it may actually improve by the homeowner having additional income to maintain their property. My wife and I have a combined income of right at six figures in any given year. We have a difficult time staying in our home, funding our retirement account. We live modestly. All of our peers are in the same boat. We're asking people of my age, is it worth staying in Santa Barbara? And increasingly those conversations lead to the answer of no. So for us, an ADU is essential to our ability to stay here once either my wife or I retire or slow down. So I just would ask the city to maintain a posture of reasonableness if you want people like us to continue to live here, and young people who are penalized by the cost of living. Some of them will never be able to save their way into financial stability. We have friends whose daughter just is paying $1,400 for 188 square feet with a hot plate. That poor girl will never, ever be able to build a savings. So again, I don't know spit about the requirements and the details of this, but I do know that it's something that is desperately needed. And in our case, it will not impact the neighborhood negatively.
Thank you. Lori Rafferty, followed by Everett Woody.
Hi, thank you for allowing the public input on this process. I wasn't able to make any other of these addressing ADUs for just being working or busy or on vacation, so here I am, and I'd like to say I am one of the property owners who now have an ADU, fully permitted. So if you want to ask me any personal questions about the process, I can answer that. I did it on my own, and I did it with some advice here and there with some architect friends. I'd recently had a project done and approved, and it was a perfect ADU conversion. Simple for me, and larger property size and off-street parking, the whole 9 yards. It's probably what, California state law was thinking of. So the previous project took 9 months to get a permit just to build a garage. My ADU took approximately 6 months. I probably drove the zoning department nuts because I was one of those homeowners that had incomplete paperwork. And I did see something where there was going to be a requirement that ADUs in the process with the department to get approved, if they're not complete, they'll get bumped out. Is that true? That was a proposal somewhere.
Why don't you finish your comment?
Okay,
and then
I would like to recommend against that because oftentimes it's not actually the homeowner, the architect issue. I had some instances where some things kind of came out of the blue. Oh, your paperwork was lost. Oh, no, it's found. So, that added time. Or, you didn't include this, or I can't read your handwriting. So, I just really don't think that should be complete. Things should get bumped out of a system when you actually institute your ordinance. We need to keep this simple. Other cities already have their ordinances in place. Community colleges are offering workshops on how to do it correctly. A well-educated public, a well-educated architectural people, they will help city staff process things fast when you know it all.
Thank you. You are at time.
My main contention is the, senior moment.
Whether they're deemed complete?
Huh? No. But I just have to say, my main contention is having a deed restriction.
Thank you. Everett Woody, you have pooled time with Mary Ellen Tiff? Yeah, thank you. Present.
Good afternoon, members of the council. My name is Everett Woody, third generation Santa Barbaran. And I'm currently passing out a letter that was sent to the city of Santa Barbara by HCD as a request by the Planning Commission. And that letter, to my knowledge, has never been read into the record. And I really would compel staff to read that letter into the record at some point. So here's my statement. If we, the citizens, are compelled to comply with all laws and ordinances that the city imposes on us, then the city must also follow the same plain language of all the laws the state imposes on it. The simple fact is, all state laws supersede all local agency laws. I assume that we can all agree on that. Furthermore, you don't have to be at all scholarly about your knowledge about the state ADU law to see that staff has their own agenda here. It has taken them over a year, countless meetings, and thousands of taxpayer dollars to draft an ordinance that does not even come close to complying with the state law. The AIA-SB drafted an ordinance in 1 week that fully complies with the state ADU statute. Oh, it was given some lip service, then discarded with the morning trash. The ADU law compels the local agency to create ordinances that are consistent with the plain language of the state statute. And I quote, "No other local ordinance, policy, or regulation shall be the basis for the denial of a building permit or use permit under this subdivision." I think that language is quite clear. What it's telling us, it's giving specific direction to staff. Do not write an ordinance that precludes the creation of an ADU. I think that's simple. I don't know why we're still here discussing open yards. When was, and then also, I would also like to bring to your attention that when was staff's ADU checklist approved by the city council? Who's running the show here? Them or you? I mean, this has been my frustration from the very beginning. I can't figure that out. So we demonstrated to the Planning Commission that the open yard requirement coupled with the FAR requirement violates the statute. That is why the Planning Commission voted 4-2 and recommended that staff eliminate the open yard requirement. So as you can, I have an exhibit, if you could put it up. Thank you. So as you can see from my graphic, that if you use the new NZO requirements and you use a typical San Roque or West Side lot, you end up with, you have a 5,000 square foot lot with a 1,500 square foot home, 400 square foot garage, an FAR that gives you up to 2,450 square feet. But if you add in the 1,250 square foot open yard requirement, you get nothing. You can't even add an addition to the back of your home to even add a junior ADU. So that option doesn't even exist. So I got to run along here pretty quickly. So now, with regards to the owner-occupant statute, the statute says, and I quote, "A local agency may require an applicant for a permit issued pursuant to this subdivision to be an owner-occupant or that the property be used for periods of longer than 30 days. That's what it says, one or the other. I can't get an answer to this question. Finally, I would like someone to compel the city attorney to finally answer the simple question, why does he think the word "or" does not mean this or that? When Monty Hall says you can choose between door number 1 and door number 2, I'm sure he didn't mean that we get to choose both. So with that said,
we're at time, Mr. Woolley.
thank you.
Thank you. And Suzanne Elledge, you will be our last speaker.
Good afternoon. Suzanne Elledge with Suzanne Elledge Planning and Permitting Services, a strong proponent of ADUs. I think with each version of the ordinance, we're getting closer and closer to the spirit of the state law and providing the opportunity to create code-compliant, less expensive housing for our own Santa Barbara residents. I want to focus my remarks today on my biggest concern, which I've expressed at each hearing, and it has to do with the blanket prohibition in high-fire areas. And that's what we still have with this new version of the ordinance. I will repeat that Senator Wieckowski, when he was here last summer for the town hall, expressly stated that it was not his intent to have a blanket prohibition in high fire areas. I want to emphasize that I believe there are certain properties in dense areas off of steep and winding roads where it may not be suitable to have additional density with an ADU. But there are many, many properties in low density areas served by wide, low gradient roads that are large, have plenty of space for an ADU and for parking. Neighborhoods that come to mind are located directly off of Highway 192 in the El Cielito and Sheffield neighborhoods. In order to ensure that a proposed ADU in one of these high fire areas is appropriate and safe, a checklist could be created and the total context of the project evaluated by the fire department. The checklist might include such items as, does the property have adequate access? Is there more than one route for ingress and egress? Does a fire hydrant exist on or near the property within a certain distance? Is the ADU equipped with fire sprinklers? Is the structure in an area of low density, or does it meet a required distance from a property boundary? Is parking provided on site for the main residence and the ADU? I urge you to take this more strategic approach, which is what the Planning Commission recommended with respect to high fire areas, instead of a blanket prohibition, which unnecessarily and substantially reduces by more than 20%, according to an earlier staff report, the number of potential ADUs and JADUs, small, new units using existing infrastructure that would primarily serve local individuals and families.
Thank you. That concludes public comment, and now it is to the council to discuss the draft ordinance amendments. Madam Mayor, your light is on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. Mr. Kalan, can we start by talking about covenants in general? Well, actually, I guess I want to start with, someone was saying that our planning staff shouldn't be writing an ADU ordinance. That they're doing their job, correct? That's why we're here.
Well, the council's heard this a number of times, so the comment about there not having been a public process caught me off guard.
Okay. And so just tell us a little bit about covenants. Does the city require covenants in other situations? And tell us how we can put one here, if need be.
Okay. Madam Mayor, your new zoning ordinance has a chapter that specifically refers to recorded agreements. And that chapter works whenever there's a special situation. Okay, so the staff can apply that. There are two issues around covenants. Issue number one is kind of a rearview mirror concern, and that is how or under what authority did the city require covenants before this ordinance was enacted. We talked about that a while back at the council, and my opinion was that the part of the government code that talks about owner occupancy or short-term vacation rentals does not require that the ordinance include that information. In other words, if you take a look at attachment 3 to your report, and this is important, I heard Mr. Woody, there are answers to all of these questions, and I frankly resent any implication that staff has a point of view distinct from the council on this. So let's take a look at 65852.2, which is attachment 3. All right. So the very first paragraph, A1, spells out the requirement for a regulatory ordinance. It's in today's packet as attachment 3. I think that's what I've got. Okay? So it says you have to do an ordinance that puts out a bunch of requirements. And if you follow it carefully, A1 then has a number of subsections, and they're capital A, capital B, capital C, capital D, that lay out what the ordinance can or can't do. All right? And the staff have followed that very closely. Separate and apart from that list of what the ordinance can contain, meaning once you get past 65852.2A1 capital D, all right? The next full section begins on the second page with 2, the ordinance shall not be considered. Keep going down the page. And 6, on the second page, it begins, this subdivision establishes the maximum standards that local agencies shall use to evaluate a proposed ADU. No additional standards other than those provided in the subdivision shall be utilized or imposed, except that a local agency may require an applicant for a permit to be an owner-occupant or that the property be used for rentals of terms longer than 30 days. All right? So what that's saying is that the owner-occupancy or anti-vacation rental sections that are in this bill or were in this bill don't have to be part of your ordinance. That's the way this legislation is written. So looking backwards, we had a covenant requirement for a long time. This legislation tries to tell us that that old covenant requirement was null and void 1/1/17. So even accepting that, the new state law authorizes the owner occupancy restriction without regard to the enabling ordinance that the new state law otherwise requires. So we feel comfortable that we can require owner occupancy. Now your question about covenants, what role do they fill? We are not staffed to enforce the municipal code across all 20,000 or so dwelling units in the city. That's just reality. The covenant is a mechanism that is used to minimize the chance of violations. So we want that on the title. We often use them in code enforcement to notify future buyers or future lenders that there is some restriction on the property, and that's what these covenants would do. Now, the banks have, at least no lawyers from the banks, but the bank staffers who have submitted letters have tried to say that the covenant is somehow a transfer of interest in the property that would be inconsistent with the requirements of the mortgage. I would respectfully submit that that's impossible as a matter of law. The right to have this second dwelling unit, this accessory dwelling unit, by definition, could not have existed before this, the right to have the second unit, which they are claiming is part and parcel of the mortgage, couldn't have existed before this state law was created. So what we're talking about is restricting a new piece of property right that the ADU applicants will get. We are not reaching back and affecting the fee title. We're not asking, we're not taking any of their property. This is strictly a way of notifying the world and lenders of this restriction. Now, it's important, I know I'm going on, but I want to cover all of this at one time. It's important to recognize, as I said, that the property owners don't have an existing right to an ADU. Therefore, the mortgagor, is that right, or mortgagee, I've forgotten, the lender's interest can't be impacted by a right created after the fact. It's a kind of equivalent to a lender complaining that you got a building permit to expand your house. I mean, that's exactly what it is. Now, the argument would be that the limitation to owner occupancy limits the value of the property. That may be, but it's authorized by state law. Why do we want them? If you turn this ordinance loose, as it's drafted with an owner occupancy requirement, I will not be able to enforce it citywide. Having the covenants on record will be our best chance of assuring compliance by lenders, realtors, buyers, and sellers. So that's the long answer. Do you have to do it? No. My advice would be, though, if you don't intend to do the covenant, please don't do the owner occupancy, because I won't be able to enforce that.
Mr. Kahlon, I've heard Mr. Vincent say, and he's been advising us, or he advised us last time, that his concern is land use speculation. So, and he referred to, or maybe I made the conclusion, because I saw what happened with vacation rental properties. People really wanted to make money doing that, and they bought properties, and I'm not sure if speculation is like casting an aspersion, but if we wanted to prevent that kind of speculation, would the covenant help?
The owner occupancy requirement enforced by the covenant would help. And certainly Mr. Vincent didn't mean to imply, and if he did, I'll disclaim it right now, I don't have any problem with people making money. That's it's the nature of our system. The question is, what role, policy question for you, and I'll defer to Ms. Brooke, what role do you want ADUs to play in Santa Barbara? And as you saw when you did the average unit size density ordinance, the effect of this kind of zoning action where you're allowing something new is to transfer a lot of wealth to the property owners who gain this future right to add to their property. So when you did the AUD ordinance, you created a mini gold rush because you added, my guess is, if not tens, probably hundreds of millions of dollars of value to the real estate in Santa Barbara. This ordinance will do the same thing. I don't know what magnitude, but you're adding a right for tens of thousands of property owners. And you have to expect people appropriately to act in their economic interest and want to take advantage of this right. So my guess is that all the demand you've seen so far is really just the tip of the iceberg. You're going to see a lot of these applications, and if neighbors are counting on owner occupancy or no vacation rentals, they're going to be let down by my enforcement ability without the covenants.
And a sunset clause would, we're looking at 3 years according to the recommendation. Would that prevent land use speculation, real estate speculation?
Well, I'm sorry, does the recommendation limit it to 3 years? That's not my...
Okay, let me reread that part then. Okay, I'm not sure if I was reading
If
something.
the question is, would a time-limited covenant
Yeah,
work?
okay, thanks.
Well, certainly in the context of affordable housing, the government has generally recognized that that doesn't have to be forever. So we use 35-year covenants, we use 50-year covenants, and that sort of thing. Is 3 years long enough? It's really up to you. It really is up to you. Where I think the covenant will raise a concern is in two places. Really where the owner, whether it's the typical homeowner that bought the place or the bank with an equitable ownership interest, if the owner-occupant goes away for some reason, that is going to create a problem for the successors of that owner. So mom and dad die in the house, the ADU is rented to a third party, what are we going to do? As I read the covenant that's currently out there, it doesn't really address that problem. So I'm not here to tell you that the covenant in its current form is perfect. I think there are situations it needs to be more flexible, but on balance, it is so critical to enforcement that, again, if you gave me a choice, I'd say don't do owner occupancy if you don't do the covenant.
One more question about the fire zone. Oh, sorry. You had a question from Mr.
Could we
Cole?
continue to talk about covenants for a little
sure.
while
Yeah,
before
go
we...
ahead.
I just had a question about how much flexibility we could have in the covenants, like specific questions. Could we include renting out the entirety of an ADU to a single family or renter without subletting the second ADU? So if it wasn't owner occupied at the time, that the whole system could be rented to a family, to a single renting entity. Is that something, not whether you agree with that's a good idea or not, but is that something that could be written into a covenant?
Pardon me, let me make sure I understand.
I'll give an
Chair.
example.
Well, no, what I hear you saying, I think, is that if I rented the entire property to one entity rather than a primary renter and a secondary renter, could you require that by covenant?
Could you allow that by covenant?
Probably.
And another specific question about that, if in the circumstance that the main house was a second home for someone, they're not living there over 51% of the time, but the ADU is a year-round renter, could that be, again, not whether you think that's a good idea, but could it be written into a covenant? Like, how detailed could the covenant be to allow for different situations?
The covenant can be as detailed as you want the ordinance to be. And I appreciate your admonition. I'm not going to tell you what's a good idea. I'll tell you about enforcement or legal issues, but I wouldn't presume. I would say that the city of San Fernando, which is well represented, last summer adopted an interim ordinance requiring covenants. I haven't tracked how many, but it's not unusual.
Thank you. So just before we get too much into questions, I just procedurally want to have a question with the committee. Do we want to discuss issue by issue and then ask our questions, or do we want to have just general questions first and then hone in on the issues we want to? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a thought, Madam Chair. Yeah, I do believe there are probably at least 3 issues that are I think worthy of separate consideration. So,
Do you want to name those three, and maybe we can get a...
well, I think it's the it's obviously going to be the covenant. It's going to be the high fire, and it's going to be the open space requirement.
Mayor Murillo, same? Okay, I have the same
I think
issues.
those have all been exhaustively discussed, but I think it's since we put this much time in, I think it's worthwhile that we explore those.
Agreed,
individually.
agreed. Do you want to start? Do you have a question?
I had a question for staff. This is kind of off what we were talking about. I want to go back to Ms. Ensberg's comment about the submittal or the acceptance of plans deemed complete versus intake. And I, not being in community development, I don't really know how to define those. Can you, Ms. Brooke, give me an idea what that is or what we're talking about?
Certainly, Madam Chair and Committee Member Rouse. The slide up here begins that discussion, and in the supplemental information that was provided to you last week, we detailed what we have in summary form for our application submittal packet that we provide to applicants. So I believe it, over the course of 3 slides, lists what we need to receive from an applicant in order to adequately review their project. So that includes an application form. That's pretty standard. The filing fee. There's a worksheet that asks for a variety of statistics for the accessory dwelling unit to confirm that it complies with state law. Photographs, a plan cover sheet that has, again, a lot of the typical data that we require for any building permit submittal, a site plan. Elevations are only required if there are exterior alterations to the building, and then floor plans. And again, that's to confirm that the physical configuration of the ADU meets the state law and confirming size and such.
Would that application be considered having been taken in prior to all that being complete, or does that have to be completed for intake?
If all that information is handed over the counter at the building and safety division counter, and it's legible and complete information, then that's considered a complete application.
All right. So I just, for example, if some kind of amendment to the ordinance, whatever happened thereafter, would that apply to that application, or?
What we're proposing with this initial ordinance adoption is that any application that's been considered complete, has already submitted all of this information prior to the effective date of our local ordinance, they could continue to process their ADU under state law. So anything submitted after the effective date of the ordinance would then come under the city's local regulations.
Okay, thank you. And then I have a question for our fire chief, too. Chief Porter. What's that? I just want to talk about some things that are going to relate to the conversation regarding the high fire area. And as we just have experienced our recent tragedies in Montecito and the upper parts of Santa Barbara, the concerns about the high fire area and what we're talking about, and I know that as in your public discussions about the response and whatnot, that the reason why evacuation worked, of course, was the fact there weren't any vehicles impeding emergency vehicles and whatnot. What concerns from your department's point of view would you have about applications for increasing the density in the high fire areas, or would you have concerns?
Madam Chair and Committee Member Rouse, we don't have a specific prohibition for ADUs in the high fire hazard area. Of course, the fire department recognizes that we also don't operate in a vacuum. And there are other concerns within the high fire hazard area that come up. For instance, density is something that the fire department isn't concerned with. How many ADUs are within a given neighborhood on a given street, those types of things are more planning and zoning oriented than they are fire department oriented. As far as our concerns, many of the city streets in the Riviera are deficient, as we know, and then as Ms. Elledge pointed out, some of them do meet our minimum standards. The problem is that at least from a discretionary point of view, it's not a good place for the fire department to be. We're not a discretionary body. We either have a code section for something or we don't have a code section for something. And even if you look at Highway 192, which technically meets our standards, you might be turning off Highway 192 into a very critical high fire hazard area. Or you might be turning off Highway 192 into a reasonably acceptable area. It varies dramatically from one end to the other. So I think the main point that I want to make is that if ADUs were allowed in the high fire hazard areas, the fire department would not want to be the sole discretionary body to say this one goes, this one doesn't, because we just don't have enough data or criteria to make those calls. A good example would be that there have been studies in the past that suggest that certain high fire hazard areas, not just in this city but throughout the country, shouldn't have, they should have, for lack of a better term, an occupant load, like you would put an occupant load on a nightclub. No study that I'm aware of has ever been able to quantify that to a degree that satisfies the test of whether or not we can apply it to a given area, because there are too many variables in any given situation. And those types of problems come up when the fire department is asked to resolve these issues in a vacuum. I think that if the council chooses to allow ADUs in the high fire hazard area, we would prefer a broader spectrum of review from at least several different divisions in the city, and not just the fire department alone making those calls.
Currently in those zones, Chief, do you have discretion as far as types of building materials, roofing materials, and also traffic circulation and parking discretion?
We don't deal with parking, although we, in planning commission meetings, as you probably noticed in the notes, that it did come up as a suggestion that alterations to parking could be made. We would resist any kind of street parking on some of the narrower streets that we have in the Riviera as a result of ADUs going in. The fire department, of course, and again, not operating in a vacuum. And just to clarify a little bit on the parking situation, when we talked about, say, a rule for no tandem parking, it actually conflicts a little bit with transportation's rule about overly paving, a given lot. Because if you don't have the tandem parking, what we'd need would be some type of turnaround for an ordinary car to turn around on the lot. And transportation, in order to minimize parking, doesn't like that type of an arrangement. Also, I think another thing that came up is no backing out into the street or something like that, and that's another thing that really isn't a requirement. I mean, it's not something that the fire department even gets into, as far as whether you back out or whether you have to pull out forward. So there are different things that could mitigate, but we haven't obviously gotten involved in a lot of them, just because we're here today to present the ordinance as an entirety to you. The other thing that I'd like to bring up is that, and this again goes to not operating in a vacuum, the ADU element of this in a high fire hazard area is carryover from the general plan, and where it was referred to as secondary dwelling units. And the general plan itself, the housing element of the general plan, and zoning can clarify this a little better than I can, but that element recommends against placing what they call secondary dwelling units in the high fire hazard area. So you'd have to, the council would have to make some kind of adjustment to that as well, probably.
And the last question was, does an ADU on a specific property in the high fire hazard area affect a defensible space?
Yes, and we would require the defensible space just like we would for any other development. In addition, the construction requirements have changed quite a bit since the 2004 Wildland Fire Plan. The building code requirements are much more stringent in the high fire hazard area.
Thank you.
I have a fire question since we're on that subject, and The staff report references the city's 2004 wildland fire plan as one of the reasons why staff is taking the position it is about that zone. And you have expertise in that, sir, and it talks about steep slopes, non-conforming roads, bridges, and driveways.
Madam Chair and Madam Mayor, that's true. And the 2004 wildland fire plan does address all of those things. And there's no doubt that and that's why we have these designated zones. They're a much higher fire risk than other zones. That, of course, in terms of ADUs, is a call for a council to make it. It's the fire department, again, doesn't specifically preclude them from the high fire hazard area any more than we would preclude building a house.
Right. I think I have a question for Ms. Brooke then, that it seems like there are areas where the extreme high fire zone, it would not be a good place to add density.
I have a figure for this that I had staff put in the PowerPoint. It might be helpful to have it up while we're discussing the extra figure. No, we're good.
You mean the 100 units that have been proposed?
It's from the from the fire plan, and it has the different zones, and where some of these zones, I was referring to them Riviera or different areas where we can see the windy roads versus the straight roads, if it's helpful.
Okay. And then it seems like some areas in the foothill zone, you could add some ADUs. So would it be a huge work project to do a map where evacuations would be easy, where it would be more challenging? I mean, people are asking for criteria, and it sounds like we haven't done that kind of work, right, where we said, there's low density here, and there's better ingress and egress there.
Madam Chair and Madam Mayor.
That sounds like a project, doesn't it?
That's a project, and it would involve some time. There are studies done. We have a recent evacuation study that was done by our consultant Dudek, and of course the wildland fire plan elements of it have been updated over the years. But we haven't done a comprehensive study, but especially with ADUs in mind, about what zone would be good, what zone would not be good. And if we did that, we would also have to take into consideration whether or not a single-family home could be built in those same areas, because the impact would be similar to putting an ADU in.
Ms. Burke, do you have a thought on that as our planning expert, if we should suggest that to City Council?
Madam Chair and Madam Mayor, is your question whether or not we could consider further in-depth analysis of these various neighborhoods and whether they would be more or less appropriate for ADUs?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
It's certainly within your ability and right to recommend that to council. I would say that would be quite a work effort that we don't currently have on our priority list to carry out at this time.
Okay. And the Planning Commission, I see Mr. Kalan wants to say something, but the Planning Commission recommended what exactly? Just remind me.
Regarding high fire hazard specifically, their final motion... Their final motion was to recommend removal of the prohibition of ADUs in high fire hazard zones with the ordinance to stipulate fire department review of all ADU applications in these zones and with additional parking required for ADUs in these zones.
Right, but what we're hearing from our fire representative is they don't want to do that kind of review. Is that what I heard you say?
Madam Mayor, that's in a nutshell about it. But the reason is because we don't really have the criteria, and anything that we did might come across as arbitrary.
Okay.
I would just add, correct. So if they, on a case-by-case basis, said this application needs an additional parking space, that's using discretion, which we're not allowed to do per the state law. And we also, after the Planning Commission hearing, we went back with our Assistant City Attorney and tried to see if there's any way that the law would allow us to just codify additional parking requirements in high fire hazard zones. And because our hands are so tied with the state law, we can't require any more parking than the maximums in the law. So it was upon further analysis after the Planning Commission motion that we realized there's not that type of discretion that they were envisioning when they made that motion.
And they wanted to get the car off the street onto the property so that, okay.
That was the
thinking.
primary intent, and then also maneuvering on the site to not have to back out into the street.
Okay. Madam Chair, I think the city attorney has a comment.
Yes, and then I have a comment too.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Brooks said what I wanted to say about discretion. I think that without having conferred in advance with Mr. Poirier, this law doesn't want you to have the public endure the time and expense of a discretionary review. So if you want to deal with the high fire, or if you want to exclude ADUs from some part of town, we need to do the homework to create a ministerial checklist of factors to be considered in whether an ADU would be allowed. So not unlike the list of design requirements. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a legal dead end to try and create a custom analysis for every parcel up in the hills. And yeah.
I'd like to ask a question regarding this, two different questions. One for our fire marshal. Thank you for being here. In your experience in evacuations, does it matter the size of the vehicles, or is it simply number of vehicles? There's, 250 trucks or 3 Mini Coopers. Does it make a difference?
Typically, it's volume, Madam Chair. It's the number of vehicles at any given choke point. The
number, the size?
The number, the sheer number.
So volume refers to just the number of vehicles.
Right. Because we are the biggest vehicles out there during an evacuation, and we're going the other way. Mm-hmm. And so that's where it becomes a problem, is if you get into a choke point where the fire engines can't get up and traffic is having trouble moving down. Now, I have to say that, we haven't really had that issue here. We've had successful evacuations 3 times, and the evacuations went smoothly, and, no one was injured in the process. And so it's, we have had successful evacuations from our foothill zones.
Do you have an established list of choke points that are traditionally an issue? You wouldn't have to say them now, but is it 5? Is it 10?
Only anecdotally. We all know what they are in our own minds. And I can give you an example. But again, even the example I'm about to give, which is what we call 5 Points South, that's Salinas and Montecito, that is typically a choke point. In the T fire, it was almost a non-factor. Mm-hmm. I don't know why. It just, we had no trouble getting up there, and the residents had no trouble getting out. But that would be one of the areas that we'd be looking at.
Okay. And then, Mr. Kalan, so I just want to understand, so looking at this map, and I'm so familiar with these areas because I've just campaigned in them, and I've walked up and knocked on every door in Northridge, every door in that San Roque block, moving over Laurel Canyon. Those are wider, broader streets, plenty of room for parking on both sides of the street, large lots, plenty of room for parking. As far as I can tell, and I'm not fire marshal, and I am operating in a vacuum at this moment, they seem easy to evacuate and not much of an issue, those 3 blocks. But then looking at the Upper Riviera, having also walked through that, sometimes you can't even walk safely on those streets, much less have cars going in 2 different directions. So at this point, if we didn't do a further work study to have that checklist, do we have the discretion to say, well, that Northridge block is fine or that San Roque block is fine, or would we need to have a background study for that would confirm that?
Madam Chair, that's a great question. You would be creating legislative findings to support an ordinance. You don't need to prove those. Those are combined factual and policy determinations. So the fundamental question here for you in exercising the city's police power to protect the health, safety, and general welfare is what's safe. So if you decide that everything feeding 5 Points is problematic, we can work that way. So your suggested approach works fine by identifying geographical locations.
And then just a follow-up question for our fire marshal. Is that in the comfort zone of not being discretionary, but working with council or working with maybe a task force to determine, to just share the information of what are the choke points and which streets are traditionally more problematic?
Madam Chair, the fire department would like to be a part of that discussion, and it's definitely something that we can contribute to. As you know, we would just want a kind of a holistic, look at everything. Just because, there you can argue almost anything for almost any street. Some of them, like I say, are no-brainers to us, but then others, you can make legitimate arguments one way or the other.
Thank you. Madam Mayor?
Thank you. So, Mr. Kalan, did I hear you suggest a ministerial checklist? And I thought that's what I heard you say a minute ago. I'm thinking about making a motion because I've heard from different sources that we should have no ADUs in the extreme high fire zone above Mountain Drive, but in the rest of the areas, a checklist of street width. What would some of those other factors be, or did you?
Yeah, well, Madam Chair, Madam Mayor, you're absolutely correct. That whether I suggested it or not, I don't know. But it was kind of a way to frame your analysis that rather than asking a fire official to exercise discretion, let's make a checklist. And this is a fundamental lawmaking problem. So Council Member Rouse and Mayor Murillo have probably heard this, but it's worth explaining for the audience too. So you've got a sliding spectrum when it comes to law and justice, right? On this side or this side, whichever you pick, is a perfectly fair decision-making system where everybody gets custom-crafted due process and they take into account your individual needs, the oddities of your lot, all of that. Very just, very, very fair, lots of balancing, but tremendously expensive. So this law sees that kind of discretionary, customized fairness as being too expensive to deliver the housing we need. So it shifts over to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is certainty. When you write a law, you can make it very certain, but there will be situations where it creates an unfairness. So as I listen to you, you're struggling with that fundamental problem that a rule forbidding ADUs in the high fire area would be too broad because it would include properties that shouldn't be included. Okay, this law pushes you that direction, but a checklist of criteria could work to narrow that discretion sufficiently to meet state law. What the criteria are is your staff job and your job.
Councilmember Rouse, did you have a comment, question?
I would just sort of make some comments that might lead towards motions, if I may. So, I'm struck by the keep it simple phrase, which I think is essential in this. And as I think about the high fire area and what we're talking about, making a discretionary checklist or something that would be very clear, working with the fire department would be important. But a blanket prohibition in an area is going to be needlessly complex and I think discriminatory. As far as comments about staff's agenda and what they're thinking about, the only agenda staff has, given the workload that we give them, is probably to try to kill us in our sleep. So I reject that outright from people in their comments. But I do appreciate the work of the Planning Commission because that's who we assigned to parse this for us. And the recommendations they came down with, by and large, fit where at least I'm thinking about. I mean, my biggest concern is on-street parking. The street is not where you store your car. That's the way it goes. But apparently the ADU really can't, the law doesn't allow us to have that much discretion along those lines. So, but neighborhood preservation is important. So in any case, I'm going to recommend that in terms of the high fire zone, that we proceed as we talked about, where we do not have a blanket restriction, but we do have a list of criteria for review. I am going to be in favor of Planning Commission's recommendation of the open yard scenario that they put forth. And the covenant is going to take some deliberation.
You're just going for the whole. Okay.
Well, I'm just saying.
Okay.
You know, I'm looking.
Throwing them out there.
I'm throwing them out there for Ms. Murillo to make the motion because you already said you wanted to make a motion. But the covenant, I think, is my only thing is how do we. I've got a few situations, certainly in my district, where people have bought up a lot of housing with this in mind. And so how do we restrict that? Can we restrict that? Can we do that without truncating property rights? What can we do? So I don't know exactly what to recommend on that, except maybe a menu of options for council to explore. With that, Ms. Murillo, you're on.
Yes. Okay. So, and do you agree, Councilmember Rouse, that no ADUs in the extreme high fire zone, or do you want that also to be part of the checklist review?
I like to be on the checklist review because I'm not exactly sure. And given, like I said, there's certain properties the Chief mentioned in the Riviera that are not in the high fire zone, were probably as problematic as any about getting emergency vehicles to. So, that's a level of expertise above mine that I'd like to maybe see if they comply with the checklist that we develop.
In the extreme high fire?
Yeah. Just in general.
Okay. So I move that we, I'm sorry,
May I weigh
Madam
in?
Chair, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I was trying to be efficient.
It's efficient. I have a few thoughts about the high fire. If I believe the blanket is too restrictive, I think it might be a nice idea to have a short-term task force, not a long one, to evaluate some areas working in collaboration that could be alleviated from that restriction, so that we do have more areas that are non-discretionary. I think that would be a good idea to move forward with those restricted, but then to have the task force to bring that back as a possibility. Just one idea. Something about, again, having knocked on so many doors, the demographic of a lot of these high fire areas is changing. You have a lot of homes that are large and rambling. There maybe used to be 5 people living there who each had a car with teenagers and family members and coming and going. And now so many of these doors are a single person left there.
I heard that too.
Yes, and knocking on doors, I had so many of the older generation deeply concerned that their younger generation, who are now my age, in their 40s, who are not able to move back. And they would really like the relief of being able to have a junior ADU or an ADU. And the net number of cars would not be going up, it'd actually be going down. Many families I spoke to had 5 children or multiple cars. And so this number of cars maybe registered living on the property may be more significant than the number of people living at the property. I like the idea that ADUs are to help people age in place, to help people pay for their mortgages, to create more affordable housing. There's no scenario where I want to create a danger that people can't evacuate from Las Alturas or from some of these roads where there's barely enough room for 2 cars to pass, much less a fire truck and multiple vehicles trying to leave out of a single entrance. So I think that could be looked at in much more detail. But in the spirit of the ADU, I can't tell you. I knocked on over 1,000 doors asking people what were issues that mattered to them. And this ADU issue seemed like such a relief to so many people. I did not encounter a single person in District 4 of the numbers that I knocked on, well, except for one single person who's on the Planning Commission, who are opposed. And I just, in the spirit of creating that housing and frankly keeping families together and allowing the demographic to change, not just from, I mean, the high fire area is District 4. We have a lot of older families who are in larger homes that are not being lived in to their fullest. So I don't want to create extra car traffic, but in the spirit of the ADU, I do think a closer look at the number of car load that a road could accommodate safely for evacuation, ingress, egress taken into account.
So for the purposes of the motion, though, are you in favor of what the Planning Commission recommends then about removing the restriction in the high fire area?
I'd be in favor of keeping the restriction because it's harder to go backward. I would be in favor of first keeping the restriction, developing a task force to quickly find some areas that could be non-restricted in that way with the checklist. So is it the narrowness of the street, the windiness of the street, the number of cars registered to occupancy at a location? I mean, I think we're not quite there where we can just lift it all and say, go for it.
Do we have applications in that area that you're aware of, Ms. Brooke?
Madam Chair and Committee Member Rouse, we do currently, the total number of, under existing state law, out of the just over 300 applications we have, 103 of those are in a high fire hazard area.
Are they deemed complete?
I don't have the statistics on those specific applications.
So that would be the maximum number that would be deemed complete, that would be already underway?
Correct. At this point, that would be the maximum that would continue under state law.
So if we decided to continue the ones that are deemed complete, you would already have an addition in the high fire area to get started?
No, once again, I think I'm going to be in favor of removing it only because I want to get back to the simplicity part. The more we try to parse this, I think the more we're going to get caught in the weeds and not get this done. And I think getting something done is better than getting nothing done. And then working with the fire chief about a discretionary checklist.
Right, right. I mean, somebody talked about the county. I think the county said they took restrictions off of the high fire zone. And only Mission Canyon, right, has a...
So, Madam Chair and members of the committee, I can just speak to my experience. I used to work for the county and Mission Canyon, and I have not looked at their ordinance recently, so I don't want to say this is what it says now. But in the county, the last time I looked at their ordinance, they are restricting ADUs in what they call special problems areas. And those are designated for various reasons. It's not just high fire. It could be sewer, access, water, things like that. Mission Canyon is designated by the county as a special problems area. And so, like I said, I haven't looked at it recently, so I don't know if they're upholding that. But I know originally no accessory dwelling units were permitted in Mission Canyon, except for they had very limited circumstances where if one property owner owned 2 lots, they could build a second unit on the lot where their primary unit is, and then they'd have to forever not build on the second lot. But
Thank you, Ms. Deisty. I'm in agreement with Councilmember Rouse that no restriction until we figure out where. Is that what you were saying, Councilmember Rouse? Yeah. And with the fire department and the planning experts to make that checklist.
I'd like to submit that the Mission Canyon is in these areas. So if you lift this restriction right now and say to go ahead and build, you are relinquishing that checklist until a much later date. I'm not comfortable at all with saying go ahead and build in our high areas and in our possibly problematic areas in Mission Canyon or Los Alturas or some areas that we know are extremely dangerous and narrow. I feel if we lift the restriction now, it's going to be much harder to come back later. What do we do if then a mortgage is already secured on that or permits are in place? I think we have enough thousands of, how many thousands are in the rest of the city? Is it 10,000 that are available?
Approximately 11,000
11,000
potential lots are outside of the high fire hazard
potential
areas.
lots outside. I do want to address those, but I think to just lift it's actually causing me a little bit of panic to think about all of those nooks and crannies being developed before we've had the task force or looked at those details in that zone. And with so many already underway, there's processes happening there. It just gives us time to look at this zone. I think we're justified in not permitting ADUs at this moment because of the hazards. I would really like to not lift the restriction at this point with a task force in place to look at where it is safe to do so.
So we're making recommendations to the city council today. We might finish and get them done, and in which case, the six of us, I hope we get to it before June, we would make a decision about that. So right now, people can apply to build these, right? That's what's going on. They can apply in the extreme high fire. So I know that's just the reality of it until city council. So really the point is to get this to city council as soon as possible so council can say what to do with the high fire zones. And if we're in disagreement...
I think there will be people putting in permits and spending time and hiring architects and with the expectation that, it's lifted. We can build anywhere in there the same as anywhere else in the city. I think it ultimately costs people time, money, expectation. I'm not saying we're going to do a blanket restriction, but I think if you keep the restriction in place at this point, while moving forward to lift restrictions, you have more control over that.
Am I correct? There is no restriction right now, right, Madam
That's
City
correct.
Planner?
Per state law, correct. People can be proposing, and they are, ADUs in these areas.
And I will say, Madam Chair, if I may, since the fire department does not have a red light in front of this themselves, that's kind of where I'm going with this. Is that if there were compelling, and I completely understand your logic, and that's where I was leaning before this, but without a compelling finding that it's necessarily worse, I think the lack of sewer kind of concerns me more than the access, because as the chief said, we do have access points to most of those places. Some of the places that are not in the high fire area even have worse access points. So I'm having a hard time making the finding that says we have a restriction.
I'd like to propose that we make the motions for each of these considerations separately rather than bringing the three together.
Yeah, good call.
Okay. So, and I'm sorry we're in disagreement, Councilmember Sneddon. I move that we recommend to the City Council that our planning staff and our fire staff prepare a list of ministerial checklist of criteria related to ADUs in the high fire zone. Extreme high fire zone and high fire zones, both.
I'll second that, but are we going to include about the restriction in the high fire zone in terms of the Planning Commission recommendation?
Say that.
The not restricting the higher fire zone. That would be the item, and we could add
right
along with your other
right, and incorporating the Planning Commission recommendation.
Second.
Of removing the restrictions.
I want to understand the motion. So the motion is to have a task force or staff and fire looking at where they could be removed, but to move forward with a recommendation that we not restrict it in the high fire at this point. Is that the motion?
Right. No restrictions in the extreme high fire or the high fire zone until we have a ministerial checklist of criteria.
I'll be voting no on that.
That's fine.
That's second.
So we have a motion from Madam Murillo, a second from Councilmember Rouse. And I think we should take a roll call vote.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Aye.
Aye.
Madam Chair Snedden?
No. Okay. I had a separate question about the fire requirements just on some of the ADUs I'd like to ask quickly. With the, let's see, it's in chapter 30.185. It's the owner-occupied question, and it, oh, sorry, no, it's not owner-occupied. It goes down to item U, number 7, where sprinklers are not required. And I'm wondering if there's interest up here, or if staff could answer for me, if maybe we could require smoke detectors or fire extinguishers or something?
Madam Chair, the lack of sprinkler requirement, of course, is the government code that has removed our ability to require sprinklers. And keeping in mind that a sprinkler system in a single-family home or in an ADU only prevents a fire from originating in that particular unit and spreading, outward. The sprinkler system itself is not going to stop an oncoming wildfire.
Can we require smoke detectors and fire extinguishers in any new ADU? Is that something we can require?
The smoke detectors are already required,
Okay.
and they'd be required for any residential unit. Fire extinguishers typically are not required for single-family homes or duplexes.
Okay.
That would be something that you could additionally require.
Okay, thank you.
Can we move on to the covenant question?
Yes.
So I found where I saw that 3-year reference. So it's the hardship waiver would, and I'm looking at page 3 of our agenda report, Ms. Brooke. So a hardship clause allows property owners to apply for a waiver of the owner occupation requirement for a period of up to 3 years. And so people have been talking to me about having the covenant sunset after 3 years. So I think that's where I had that in my head. And I saw Mr. Pujo's recommendations. He's okay with a covenant as long as there's a sunset clause in it. And this takes me back to my question to our city attorney about preventing real estate speculation where someone is just going to buy up properties and not really look out for our workforce and our housing stock. Of course, people make money, right? So if we had a covenant that sunsetted after a certain time, would that prevent real estate speculation? And I'm asking you, Mr. Kalan, because it was Mr. Vincent that I felt was carrying that flag at the last meeting. Wasn't he?
I don't know. I just put Mr. Colon in a new position.
Madam Chair, Mayor Murillo, I don't have a separate interest as city attorney in real estate speculation. And whether 3 years will prevent that, I really can't answer that.
But we could make a covenant that has a time frame on it, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not in favor of a sunsetting.
I'm sorry?
I'm not in favor of a sunsetting covenant.
So you'd like a covenant that just lasted forever?
I would. I think we could have some other flexibilities in the covenant, but I don't think sunsetting it takes care of preserving character of neighborhoods.
Can I ask how you feel about it being in the single-family zone only?
If we had a covenant in the single-family zone, I see what you're saying. So
Yeah, some people
okay.
have suggested as a compromise that if we do a covenant, that it not be in the multifamily zones, that it just be in the single-family zone as a compromise.
I would be okay with that.
Yeah, I just that makes sense logically to me. I just wonder if that is that doable? Is that discriminatory, Mr. Klon? Can we parse that out that way?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Rouse, yeah, it's discriminatory, but it's not illegal.
Okay. And I'd ask staff, hello, staff? In a situation like that, from a practical application standpoint, single-family versus multifamily zones, whether there was a restrictive covenant or not, how does that play into the big picture in terms of, clearly what we're trying to do is not to complicate somebody's real estate transaction, but we're also trying not to have one person buy 20 homes and duplex them. So does it make sense from that logical standpoint to say covenant in the single-family zones and not have it in the multifamily zones, since they're already duplexes and triplexes?
Madam Chair and Committee Member Rouse, when those arguments have been made in prior public hearings, the distinction between a covenant and a single-family zone or multifamily zone, typically the one arguing for having a covenant only in the single-family zone was speaking to that expectation you have of when you buy property or live on property in a single-family neighborhood, and you expect the character and the activities of the neighborhood to reflect a single-family type zoning. Whereas if you buy property or live in property in multifamily zones, you have a variety of different types of housing configurations around you, and do you have that same expectation of more typically stability in terms of ownership, a higher rate of property home ownership occupancy in single-family zones than in multifamily zones. So that's typically where I've heard arguments made. It was more that expectation of when you are buying or living on property in those two different zoning areas, would the covenant help protect that expectation in the single-family zones versus multifamily?
Well, it's certainly where if I was going to go with that, that's what I'd like to do. I'd like to be more versed in the debate and the information regarding bank financing, regarding different things like execution of property over a trust or a family trust, or pass-throughs and all. I mean, there's a lot of complications that are way above my pay grade that I certainly wouldn't want to codify to make life more complicated for somebody who owns a property. The other side of the coin is I also don't want to be part and parcel to the duplexing of a bunch of single-family zoned houses. So I'm still struggling with this one. I would like to forward that discussion to the full council for debate, but I certainly would like to be better versed in the ups and downs of it.
May I add, for the single-family residence zones, I would like the covenant to add the flexibility. I'm just trying to gauge here to be able to rent out the entirety with the ADU to a single family or single renter without subletting. I know when my family was renting, we looked at a lot of homes that had another unit in the back that we wouldn't have rented out, but that it seemed like it would be fine to rent to an entire family rather than, I don't know. That's one flexibility to think about. And then another is if the main house is a second home, we have so many of those in the Riviera and in some of the more expensive, larger homes where the main house is not occupied year-round, but an ADU on the premise could be and provide housing year-round.
Could be. I'm just looking at Mr. Kalan and thinking that whole enforcement thing going across his forehead while we're trying to figure this out. Mr. Kalan.
Madam Chair, thank you. So I said probably about the covenant restricting the rental to a single family unit. I'm nervous about that, and the reason is it's not clear to me how much the city is or should be welcome into the private dealings of a family. And I think you need to respect that as a general principle. More specifically, I'm not sure the state law gives us the discretion to specify who gets to be there other than the owner.
Thank you. That's a very excellent point. And what about the main house if it's a second home? if we don't have an ADU on it that's being rented, then that entire property is not usable for housing.
Well, once again, you're going back to, there's obviously the quote-unquote spirit of the law that was passed to say we're going to provide all this extra housing. There's also the one-size-fits-all for the entire state, and we have the responsibility of preserving neighborhoods and expectations for people who have bought properties and own properties in this area. So we have to balance that, I think. And which is what the thing we banged up against when we went to enforce vacation rentals. It's what is the expectation? Clearly now the state has said thou shalt develop this extra density. We shall provide this housing. The question is are we going to provide duplexes everywhere that are owned and managed by a single entity, or is it going to be more of the style that we're used to, where you build a granny in the back for granny or the kid coming home or whatever, and there's going to be enforcement issues, and I don't think it can go without some kind of sunset. I think that would have to happen if you're going to have a covenant. Covenants are complicating matters, which is negative as well. But I don't know how to prevent what certainly my neighbors fear in my part of the world in terms of people buying up, speculating on housing and student housing and all that kind of thing. What's it going to take to make a Santa Barbara neighborhood remain a Santa Barbara neighborhood?
Are we coming to any agreement here? I think we're friendly to a covenant, but there's so many people who don't like it. And I was trying to find the sunset clause as a way to answer the question of speculation, right? So if an owner was required to live there for a certain period of time, that's not like a whole bunch of investors getting together and eyeballing our real estate market and playing games with it. So we could put something to the city council that we're friendly to covenants. We're just not sure if there should be a sunset clause.
Well, and I have to say to back up what you said as well is that if the spirit of the law is to provide housing for people who are workforce and or granny or family members, that not having a covenant is antithetical to that, because it does invite speculation, especially in a very tight, very expensive real estate market like Santa Barbara. I mean, it's a different world. We've seen gold rushes and other things before, and that could be the next one. So the original spirit was to provide either a housing unit for granny or to make the one legal that you already have, that kind of thing. And that's where we'd like to stay. But how do we protect from the stampede? And that's, and I don't know that. I'm not a real estate guy, but that's what I would assume.
I would think that sunsetting at 3 years is not long enough. I think it's entirely possible that a speculator goes and lives in that residence for 3 years while they're fixing up this other residence and then switch to that residence. And I don't see 3 years as a long enough sunset to take care of that. I would support the covenant in single-family residence zones and
only single-family zone.
Yes,
you like that too. With the possibility of a sunset period to be determined.
Propose a range, 3 to 5 years or something along those lines. The one thing is you, like I said, you get into, transfer of estates, somebody needing to leave the country for work for a year, and there's got to be some type of way to appeal or to handle that situation, because people do get assigned to work overseas for a year at a time. Visiting professor, from UCSB going to Michigan for a while. So we have to kind of consider that as well.
I agree.
Madam Chair, I think the Planning Commission did flesh it out a little bit. Didn't they add to the hardship waiver requirements, Ms. Brooke? So they said be a little more liberal. It's not just death. It's if someone has to work or do something else. And that's at the discretion of the Community Development Director?
Madam Mayor, you're correct in that the Planning Commission asked staff to add some more hardships to that clause. And one was extended travel, another was job transfer. And so we can we can certainly add those types of situations that would qualify for a period of time when either of the units are not owner occupied.
I move that we recommend to the City Council a covenant on ADUs in the single-family zone with consideration of a sunset clause to be determined.
Did you
have add some pearls of wisdom?
Please.
Well, I believe we already have the direction to address the hardship stuff, so we will take a shot at that before we come back to council. So I'm assuming your motion included that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Not sure if I got a second.
Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Can I propose an amendment to not add the sunset clause at this time? If you say no, that's okay. I just want to put that out there.
Are you asking for an amendment or a
I'm asking if there's a second on an amendment to that motion to have it just be without the sunset clause at this time.
I'm sorry to disagree with you, Councilmember Snedden. I think there should be a sunset clause, and if you two voted the other way, I would speak my piece at the City Council level, but I'm not sure what Mr. Rouse is going to say.
Oh, neither is Mr. Rouse.
Okay.
No, I think a sunset clause is helps to mitigate the complex nature of adding the covenant into this thing in the first place. So I think we do have to have a sunset clause.
Okay, ready for a roll call vote?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse,
Aye.
Mayor Murillo,
Aye.
Madam Chair Snedden.
No.
Turn it. Okay.
Okay, so we've covered fire, we've covered covenant, and open space was the other. Do we feel we have enough time to address this
Yeah,
now?
if we can buzz through it.
Okay.
I'll move the Planning Commission recommendation on open space.
Can
or was there
we
one?
can
Was
we
that
find a joint page
So
that
that
we're
was the
referring
AA
to?
one.
We've had a couple different.
Well, in that case, I believe that was, if I'm not misspeaking on that, the 10% lot area, or the 10 by 10 foot dimension.
Madam Chair and Committee Member Rouse, the motion from the Planning Commission minutes, I'm looking at, in the Planning Commission minutes of January 25th, page 11 of 12. The motion is that recommend that staff analyze flexibility of the open yard area standard based on ADU size and the idea that to the extent that the maximum unit sizes reduce open yard, that is acceptable. Sorry, reading that up, that doesn't sound entirely clear. That motion did pass on a 4-2 vote.
So if I may, then I think what we're looking at is a recommendation from the architects then, which is
That's correct.
10% of the lot area, 10 by 10 minimum dimension, and allowed to overlap driveway on lots 5,000 square feet or smaller. Is that what you were looking at, Mr. Rouse?
That's correct.
I would second that.
I would like to keep the open space requirements as they are. I think it affects livability. I think there are enough opportunities for ADUs within those restrictions. Once you lose that open space, it's gone. And again, I'm in favor of have it being more restrictive at this point and keeping them as they are.
Yeah, I've just seen too many examples of projects brought before me that were complicated, looked viable, but because of the current open space requirement, weren't able to do, and they look like they actually fit in the neighborhood. And once again, my big concern would be on-street parking, but since that can't really be an issue, then I have no problem with the AIA recommendation.
Ms. Dieste, if I may, Madam Chair?
Yes.
So would that, our motion is workable for planning staff? 10% of lot area and 10 by 10 minimum dimension?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, yes, we could draft it that way if that's your recommendation.
Somebody help me. Did we make a motion and second it?
I'll move that.
With the allowed to being overlapping the driveway on lots 5,000 square feet or smaller. I'll second that.
And then could I ask staff to speak to this on page 10 of the Planning Commission minutes? There was a motion that staff analyze flexibility of open yard standard to the extent and recommended earlier reduced yard that is acceptable. I'm not really clear on what that is referring to. So if well, there's a motion and then no, it's a motion on the bottom of page 10. And the motion is that staff analyze the flexibility, and then it remained on the floor, and then it was voted on page 11 that the recommendation that staff analyze flexibility, and that's where the Planning Commission left it, from how I understand it, is that staff analyze the flexibility. And I believe the motion that is on the floor right now supersedes that. Did staff analyze that? Have we come back with a new recommendation after Planning Commission direction?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I understand your question. So you're correct. The motion, the discussion and the motion that the Planning Commission made was in response to the original drafting of the ordinance, which had our current open yard requirements, which are these. So going into the Planning Commission hearing, we were recommending that these current open yard requirements apply to accessory dwelling units, which is you need a minimum of 1,250 square feet for any lot 5,000 square feet or larger. That's reduced to 800 square feet on lots less than 5,000 square feet. A minimum dimension of 20 by 20, but they can be located in one area or multiple areas, as this diagram is showing, the 1,250 square feet divided up into two areas. So that was going in the Planning Commission hearing. That was our recommendation. Through their discussion, they asked us to consider flexibility, and so the ordinance was amended to allow accessory dwelling units to encroach a maximum of 20% into the open yard, or 150 square feet, whichever is greater.
So I'm understanding that after going through Planning Commission, after discussion, coming back to you for flexibility, that this is, and as you described, is a compromise amongst all of those. I'm in favor of supporting this rather than another number thrown out today that we haven't considered and staff hasn't considered more carefully.
Yeah, I'll withdraw my motion.
Okay. I'd like to make a substitute motion then to propose the ADU ordinance comply with staff recommendations following the Planning Commission meeting. Or is there a way you want to refer to this?
Madam Chair, that staff recommendation is drafted in the ordinance that was attached to your council agenda report from February last week.
Thank you. Then I move that we use the staff recommendation in the current draft ordinance for the open yard space. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Any discussion? We have a roll call vote on that.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
Aye.
Mayor Muriel.
No.
Madam Chair Snedden.
Yes. And then quickly, I just want to mention two things we haven't talked about are junior ADUs, which at some point was proposed that those might be allowed in the high fire, but we'll let that go for now. Are there any other items before this goes to council that we want to discuss? Madam Mayor?
Yeah, remind us, what was the junior ADU? They're not allowed in extreme high fire? Or was that your question?
Okay. Madam Chair and members of the committee, so junior ADUs were treated the same as ADUs as far as the prohibition in the high fire hazard areas were concerned. One member of the public spoke up at our last meeting and requested that we make that change and allow the junior ADUs in the high fire hazard areas. That didn't come up in your discussion of the high fire hazard zones, but that's something you could consider. And just as a reminder, a junior ADU is just converting an existing bedroom in an existing home to an accessory unit.
I'm in favor of these.
I'm good with that.
Do we have a motion?
Go ahead.
I'll make a motion to allow junior ADUs in the high fire zone.
Second.
May we have a roll call vote?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Aye.
Mayor Murillo?
Aye.
Madam Chair Snedden?
Aye. So do we need a motion to bring this to City Council as amended and as recommended with changes?
That's correct, Madam Chair. I would like to go back through what I took down so I make sure I've got it right. So I heard 4 motions that will guide us. The first was with respect to fire, and it was a motion by Mayor Murillo, seconded by Councilmember Rouse, to recommend to the City Council that planning and fire staff prepare a ministerial checklist for both extreme and high fire zones, and no restrictions in any fire zone until the ministerial checklist has been prepared. And that carried 2-1. On the covenant, the motion was from Mayor Murillo, and it was seconded by Councilmember Rouse. It was a covenant with some consideration of the length of time of the covenant for the City Council. And then secondly, it was for single-family residential zones only. And I don't remember, I don't think it's R1 in the new ordinance. I don't remember what it is. RS? Thank you. Okay. And then finally, or third, open space, the motion by Councilmember Rouse was withdrawn. Chair Snedden, with a second by Councilmember Rouse, followed the Planning Commission's motion on open yard requirements based on the current staff draft. And that carried 2-1 with Murillo no. And the allow junior ADUs in the high fire zone, I had a motion by the chair and a second by Mayor Murillo, and I didn't get the vote. Was that
It was unanimous.
Unanimous. Thank you very much.
In favor.
Okay. So, yes, I think the motion would be to recommend to the council that the ordinance be approved with these changes.
Thank you. Do we have a motion? Councilmember Rouse, motion.
Second.
Seconded by Mayor Murillo. We have a roll call vote.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Aye.
Mayor Murillo?
Aye.
Madam Chair Snedden?
Aye. And with that, I would really like to commend staff for all of your reiterations on this, and thank you very much for answering our questions, community questions, planning commission questions, and I'm sure you'll be back around for city council questions. So thank you. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.